Hello, I'm Christie Welch, Direct Food and Agricultural Marketing Specialist with OSU Extension. Stay tuned as we see Part 2 of Farms and Fun, Reducing Liability Risk for Agritourism Operations. Hello and welcome to Marketing Matters. I'm Christie Welch, Direct Food and Agricultural Marketing Specialist with OSU Extension, and today we're going to hear more from Peggy Kirk-Hall and Eric Barrett about Farms and Fun, reducing the liability risk for your agritourism operation. And in the Part 2 today, we'll be hearing more about common elements of agritourism laws across the country. We'll hear a little bit about insurance and how it is kind of special for agritourism operations, and then we're going to talk about emergency preparedness and safety issues with your farm.
A second common element in these statutes is that they will extend only to inherent risks of the agritourism activities, and this is important for our operators to understand. They don't cover everything. They only address or give liability protection for those activities inherent risks. So those are the naturally occurring risks that, as I said before, the operator has little control or no control by virtue of the nature of that activity. Many of the statutes define what they mean by that, and they'll list examples, and I'll show you here in a moment of another statute that does that. But it's fairly consistent around the country, but the big difference that I see from state to state is whether the possibility of contracting a disease from animals or from manure would be considered an inherent risk. Only Ohio, here in Ohio, we have a statute that goes the furthest in that regard, and it specifically states that the possibility of contracting illness from physical contact with animals or manure would be considered an inherent risk. The state of Maine has language that says the depositing of manure is an inherent risk of agritourism, but those are the only two that specifically call out that situation. And so in other states that don't have that language, we don't know. It would be up to a court basically to decide whether a zoonotic disease transmitted by an animal would be considered an inherent risk that state statute protects. So that's a concern for those of you who have animals and don't have the animal language as part of your inherent risk definition. There are also a number of laws that make sure to call out the participant's action within the inherent risk definition and state that how that participant behaves on the farm is an inherent risk of the activity, and so that would be covered by liability. And we all know that sometimes participants don't follow directions or stay where they're supposed to stay, and so those kinds of activities would be deemed inherent risks that would be covered by the law. Here's, I saw we have Kansas on here too. Boy, I got lucky in choosing statutes from our participants, but this is how Kansas, which actually was the first state in the nation to have an agritourism immunity law, and they've had that in place for quite a while now. They define inherent risks in Kansas, as you can see here. So those dangers or conditions that are an integral part of that activity. And then it includes, but doesn't limit, inherent risks to these types of things: land surfaces, subsurfaces, conditions of the land, vegetation and water, the behavior of animals, both wild and domestic, and the kinds of structures or equipment that are ordinarily used in farming or ranching. So that's a good example of how we typically define, and you can see there it also includes the potential of a participant to behave in a negligent manner in a way that contributes to their injury. Okay, another important part of these statutes is the exception section, and they all have it, and they'll say, okay, in these particular situations, this statute will not protect the agritourism provider from liability. And some common exceptions would be if the operator behaves with negligence or willful or wanton disregard to those to the safety of those visitors, or if the operator had not actual knowledge of a dangerous condition and still didn't do anything about it, or didn't properly train employees. That's in a number of statutes around the country. Failing to vaccinate or quarantine animals, that's only in a couple. Permitting minors to use facilities or equipment that doesn't match that minor's age or abilities. We see that in a lot of the exceptions. Failing to make a reasonable inspection of the property or the equipment, or failing to meet the affirmative requirements of the law. So it's important to know what those exceptions are in your state and understand that you still have to do some basic things like inspect your equipment, train your employees. You can't lean on this immunity law to protect you from every possibility of harm. You still have a lot of responsibility as an operator. I mentioned affirmative requirements, and all of the statutes do have specific actions that an operator must take in order to have that liability protection. And by far the most common, all but 2 states require that notices must be given to the participants, either in the form of a posted warning sign or also possibly in the form of adding the notice to written agreements and contracts. And then there are a handful of states that also require the agritourism operation to register with the state or have an approved operation plan. And that's only in 1 state that we see that. Louisiana is the only state that requires an approved operation plan. Here are the states, as I said, all but 2 require operators to post a warning sign, and I'll show you one of those in a moment. And then about half of those also require the operator to include that same warning in any contract or written agreement that they would have with others. So the very common affirmative action required by the operator, and in all cases, if the operator doesn't do that, the operator is subject to losing that liability protection. Here is Wisconsin's law, and this, as the other examples I've provided, is indicative of how states require the warning. There are a few states that have a very short warning that's not nearly this detailed, but for the most part, this is the common type of warning that must be posted on a sign and or included in written contracts. And again, there we're trying to shift that understanding. Hey, you need to know that there are dangers involved here, and we're warning you about that right now, and giving that person the chance to turn around and walk away, given that knowledge that there are risks on a farm that could harm them. As I said, a handful of states, I think there are 8 states that require registration of the agritourism operation. Some of them say you may register, some say you must, but all of them say if you don't register, you don't get the liability protection. And that registration can be fairly simple, as far as just notifying the agency, filling out a short application. Louisiana also requires the operation plan certification that lists what is going to be happening on that farm, how they're going to minimize the risks, where their warning signs are, and Louisiana Extension is in charge of reviewing and approving those applications, which must be updated every 5 years or whenever a new activity is added. So a question I often hear is, what about waivers? And Eric and I were talking earlier, and he knows that I'm not a big fan of waivers because so many waivers can be legally challenged for not appropriately notifying the person of the dangers or risks that they're about to encounter, and for attempting to just say, don't make me liable for anything, please, as the operator. So a lot of times they're not enforceable, but many farms still use them because their insurance provider might want them to have a waiver, or their attorney. So do we still need those? Are they useful? Well, a lot of times in these immunity statutes, the statute kind of negates the need for the waiver for particular things, but it might not address everything that farm is doing. And so you may still need to consider having a very well, carefully drafted by an attorney type waiver to address other activities that the immunity statute might not provide. And this is a good tool in those states that doesn't have an immunity statute, a good tool to use. But again, I would encourage that waiver be very carefully drafted by an attorney and not just a general release of all liability for anything that would happen. That's not going to be legally defensible. Now, I mentioned that there are other immunity laws that might apply, and I just want to quickly point those out. I explain these in that fact sheet on immunity laws. They're recreational user statutes in every state in the nation, and they give immunity for recreational uses that are permitted on the property. Sometimes they say that only if you're not receiving a fee, though. So in a for-charge situation, these might not be useful. But if you want to see your states, go to the National Ag Law Center site and look for the state compilation on recreational user statutes. We also have UPIC immunity laws that come into play in some states that shift liability away from the operator for those who are on the farm to pick fresh produce directly from the farm, but those are pretty narrow. But if you're that type of operation, that might be useful. And then if you have equine, horses, donkeys, those kinds of animals, the Equine Activity Acts are also, all but 2 states have those. They give liability protection for those inherent risks of being around equine, and most all of them require the posting of warning signs. So these are laws that can be raised as a defense if an operator is sued for a personal injury that occurred on the agritourism operation. And as I said, it has to be only if it was a harm resulting from an inherent risk and the operator has met all of the definitions and affirmative requirements of the statute. But they don't replace best management practices and insurance. Insurance is a traditional tool that we see for agriculture, and it's one that an agritourism operation needs to carefully consider because it requires special insurance for the agritourism operator. It's typically not going to be covered, it being an agritourism injury incident. It's typically not going to be covered under your general property policy, and so a customized rider would be necessary, and that's what we're referring to as agritourism insurance. And that rider will amend the coverage that's available on that umbrella policy and add some additional coverage above and beyond what that general policy covers. So you've got to be careful about tailoring that rider to the activities that are taking place. Eric, what did you say costs for agritourism insurance is?
I think a lot of farms are between that 3.5% and 4%, depending on what they're doing. Some of the ones that are generating a lot more revenue, usually the company will come back to you over time. Well, I know a lot of farms get an audit every 2 or 3 years. What are your activities and how much revenue is coming in from each activity?
Right.
And then prices change based on that, even though they tell us it doesn't cost per activity.
Oh, okay. So those are the kinds of factors they examine, though. You gave a couple of examples of what, they'll assess your situation and look at those things, the types and number of activities, how much revenue, the number of visitors, what kinds of risks are there, what kinds of practices do you have in place, are you in compliance, and then the state's immunity law. All of those factors will lead us to what that number might be for how much it will cost to have a particular activity covered. But not all companies offer these. We're seeing more and more. Would you agree that it is increasing the number that will offer?
So it finally really started changing about 2008 or so, that more insurance companies are covering it. It seems though once they have so many, once a specific carrier has 10 farms, like, okay, that's all we want, in addition to our other business.
Oh, okay. So they've got to balance their risk portfolio and can't have too many agritourism operations. So some considerations here, if you need to find a company, is, look for one that is familiar with agritourism or has some other agritourism clients, because they are going to be, I think, more helpful in assessing and covering those activities. There are ratings for insurance providers, and so you want to check that, the AB Best rating. You need to carefully review everything that you are doing. Don't hold anything back, because that thing that you don't tell them about might be the thing that someone's injured on. And so you've got to have everything covered if they're willing to cover it. Be aware of the exclusions. Again, this goes back to zoonotic diseases. There was a major problem up in Minnesota where a young child contracted a zoonotic disease from a pumpkin farm from interacting with the animals there, and it came from the manure. They were able to trace that to the manure, but the policy said that there was a pollution exclusion, and the insurance provider said, well, manure is pollution, and therefore that is not covered by your policy. So you've got to understand what those exclusions are and then manage accordingly based on what that policy says. It's a good idea to keep regular communication and good records. And we're going to talk a bit about preparedness and practices, and that, of course, is something that you just can't disregard. Because you have an immunity law and insurance, you still need to address preparedness for emergencies and injuries on the farm. So Eric, up to you now.
Okay. To follow up on insurance too, we thought in Ohio, well, maybe we'll see cheaper insurance rates with this new law. Of course, that did not happen. So don't expect that in the future. So real quick, and then we'll ask for some questions. We'll quickly review emergency preparedness. We won't have time to go through all the details, but if you go to this site, it's u.osu.edu/agritourismready. So it's kind of like ready.gov, where we came up with the concept of helping farms write an emergency preparedness plan. So the bulletin they can print out is also on the National Ag Law Center.org site. You can print out the bulletin, but they can also print it out on this site, and then they go through the website, the clicks, and fill out each section. So it helps the farm prepare their actual plan and think about what activities they're doing they might need to add to the plan we've prepared. Here's what the site looks like. So it's pretty simple. It's all point and click. On the left side are all the units. So there's a whole section of units. And then if you click on each unit, like how to start your plan, you see acknowledgments, disclaimer, diversity and assistance, and how to use. So they can go skip chapters if they want to, but down in the far right where we see first chapter acknowledgments, and anything that's in red in the bottom corner is how they go to the next page. So it even goes through risk management and helps them identify some of the stuff that Peggy talked about, not in quite as much detail, but how do they manage risk, what's a safety for an activity versus emergency preparedness, and how do they train their employees, which is one of the things you saw in a lot of those immunity laws, is that if you didn't train people properly, then it's still your fault as an agritourism operator. Going through risk management, and this is what we really try to push farmers, is what do you do? And if you look at the high severity, high frequency, it's this reduce, transfer, or avoid. So that's where we really are looking at that activity decision-making tree we talked about earlier, is where does this activity fall? And a lot of these fall in the we need to reduce, transfer, or avoid kind of category. So depending on what that is, and I would say a slingshot is probably in that category because it's high frequency, and the severity is high because an apple hits you in the face, you could lose your eye or sight in that one eye. And one eye is pretty expensive. Safety versus emergency. So the safety things, to try to get your arms around this if you're working with a farm, is putting in a fire control system, making rules, eliminating potential injury by installing something correctly, having equipment backups. So when we get to emergency, we're not just talking about safety of employee or an accident that happens, or we're talking about business continuity as well. Because we want to make sure, what if the power goes out and you can't run credit card machines on a Saturday in October, there could be hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake for that farming operation. So emergency preparedness from the National Fire Protection Association, activities, tasks, programs, and systems developed and implemented prior to an emergency used to support the prevention of, mitigation of, response to, and recovery from emergencies. So that's pretty long, but we tried to simplify that into this very simple flow chart. So we want to prepare, so write the plan, figure out what we need, and then part of that plan is respond and mitigate when an accident does happen or when an emergency happens, like in a storm, how to recover from that, and then how to improve practices. And in here, once you go through it, it really talks about improving practices is about talking to your lawyer as well. So, for example, if there's a hayride accident, before you correct what you think needs improved, talking to your insurance agent and your lawyer of should we do it now or should we wait till litigation is over with? Questions like that. So why be prepared? Because they don't discriminate. Accidents happen everywhere. It ensures the safety of the business for the long term. And we're definitely unique compared to other businesses in agritourism. Part of this is the support team we encourage through them making the plan. So county emergency management, local fire departments. It's interesting when a fire department, one of our local farmers where we're at here in Central Ohio, actually has the fire department come out every year and review, can you get the fire truck to all the locations at the farm? Can the squad get to these places? Would this impact our operation if somebody has a heat stroke, something like that? Because it does happen quite frequently. So each of those folks involved in that, local police, attorney, insurance, they really make a big difference in what they can provide for the farm. And then providing a finished product to team members. A lot of farms will provide a map of here's where a squad can come in, here's our procedures if this happens. So some scenarios that are in here, we just gave two quick examples. One is a traffic accident, because as you see in the photo, a lot of farms are parking on grass or a field. About 15 years ago, there was a big accident where they were parking on hay stubble, and it actually, or I think it was straw, and it actually caught on fire and burned up like 100 cars. So there can be challenges with parking lots. One of those is a traffic accident, and this really focuses on if it's on the road, it's not the role of the farm. They're to call 911, call the police, or if there's an emergency, here's what happens. Don't have employees go out on the road and start directing traffic. Versus if it happens on your property, what can you do?
And Eric, I think that's a good example of that question of, is that an inherent risk of being on a farm? The possibility that your car or you might be injured by a fire in the field there where you're parked. I think that's one that a jury or a judge might have to think over it very carefully.
So in Ohio, which I think many other states, we learned this year that this kind of a parking lot does not work in a wet year. So a lot of us have moved to gravel lanes, at least to drive in. So we're really working on that with a couple of the big farmers up in Northeast Ohio. And then we go through in the plan some scenarios for the farms to talk about with their employees, with their team. And this is talking about an emergency weather situation, that there's a wedding, and all of a sudden we see that we think it's going to be a passing storm. It could be really a big problem. So we ask them to answer the questions. What precautions should you take before that wedding begins? A lot of folks are using an app called Radar Scope, which a lot of meteorologists recommend, because if you use like weather.com and the Weather Channel and AccuWeather, those all go through a algorithm before they actually get to your phone, versus something like Radar Scope is live radar. So you know instantly that that changed from red to purple, which indicates there's a possibility of a tornado, things like that. What food safety concerns would there be if there's no electricity? Any ventilation concerns? If something's happening and it's too hot, is that going to be your fault as a farm because the 90-year-old grandmother fainted because you didn't provide ventilation? What if utilities go out and this wedding can't happen? What's the liability from the bride and all those kind of things that you had to provide in a contract?
Very few of these things would be addressed by an immunity statute.
Yeah.
And some might not even be addressed by insurance. And so really important to get those practices down and reduce this possibility of negligence for not doing what you should have done and be prepared.
So we talk a lot about having those backup systems throughout the plan. And then this is the one example where it talks about the little generator. Can you stay open when things happen? If there's a storm, is it a possibility? But then when the electric goes out, if it's a fast moving thing, is it worth having a generator? Definitely. But if there's things like water, when there's a boil advisory, can you really operate your food service? You can't. There's no way unless you don't use that water for anything. Septic issues that might occur, and then payment systems are one of the big things we're seeing on farms right now because everybody's moving to credit cards or has moved. Then reviewing the recovery, the thing we really push after they go through all this is what actually happens. My wife is a media person. She's a TV anchor. And we always joked when she was a reporter that the only Peggy, looks normal. She wouldn't probably talk to you if you came out as a reporter. But the woman, like Jeff Foxworthy says, that has a pink robe on and curlers in her hair wants to tell you it's pandemonium. So really knowing who's in charge, because if the farm operation does not talk to the media and at least have some kind of a statement of, yes, there's been an accident, we have no comment at this time, we're working with the proper authorities, then the woman in the pink robe with the curlers is going to be on the air saying that the farm is negligent and everything was awful and nobody knew what they were doing. So we really focusing on who's in charge, who's the communication person. Every question goes through one person, so there's not multiple statements happening. In Tennessee, there was an accident on the zip line, and it was a bad situation. So this is what we learn, and we try to put that forth to farmers to say, think about these things, and even think about a professional PR person. So again, that prepare, respond, mitigate, recover, and improve practices, all on the website. So the end result is this emergency action plan. It's a flip chart that gets hung in the buildings around the farm and talks about everything from those national disasters to fires, medical emergencies, equipment failures, traffic accidents, even armed intruders and aggressive guests. So all those different things that could happen, and then they can change that PowerPoint around. It's a PowerPoint so that both Mac and PC users can use it and identify that for their farm. They can even brand it to fit their farm's brand. So if you flip that up, right, like we did here, it has the numbers you need, who to call, what to know, and then the procedures for things that happen. We even have a pretty detailed one in the plan that talks about a lost child, or these days, even a lost adult that has Alzheimer's. So it goes through the whole scenario there. And then again, there's the website. It's u.osu.edu/agritourismready. Or if you just Google AgriTourism Ready, you will find that, and it goes through all the ways to write a plan and download the book.
Good, thank you, Eric. And I think that provides some good examples where the operator could be liable for not having taken the steps to be prepared and have practices in place that would protect the visitors on the farm in the event of some of these situations. So it's certainly a liability risk that would not be covered by most of the statutes that I'm aware of.
Thank you for joining us today for Farms and Fun, reducing liability risk for agritourism operations. We appreciate Peggy Kirk-Hall and Eric Barrett, both with OSU Extension, sharing their expertise on the topics. We heard from them about common elements of agritourism immunity laws, insurance, and safety and emergency preparedness. If you missed part 1 and would like to view that, you can go to the website listed below, as well as for additional Marketing Matters videos talking about direct marketing your food and farm products. We also would like to thank the National Ag Law Center, who originally produced this video, and have many resources on their website as well. Thank you.